As we approach the inauguration of a new presidential administration in just a few days, it might be worthwhile for us to examine the soul-searching process that progressives have undergone over the last 10 weeks, trying to figure out just exactly why Democrats were so overwhelmingly set back and defeated last November. The question is, have they learned any lessons? But there's another question. What lessons should we learn? Democrats vowed to figure out what caused their problems in the last election and to make the changes necessary to find their way back into power. Sunny Hostin, who is a participant in the liberal talk show The View, recently asked a question that truly perplexed her. She asked it of Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate. She said, how did a convicted felon resonate more with Americans than a hyper-qualified woman of color? Do you think that racism and misogyny played any part in this election? Well, first of all, we can question whether Kamala Harris was ever hyper-qualified for any leadership role, but that's a different conversation. The real question was, do you think racism and misogyny was behind the Democratic defeat? Now, to his credit, Jeffries replied, the economy was the dominant thing for a lot of folks. He went on to say that voters from across the political spectrum gravitated toward Trump, including women and people of color, because of the economy. Well, if women and people of color chose to vote for Trump because of the economy, it sort of destroys, it torpedoes this stupid question about whether he was elected out of racism and misogyny. But I'm not sure that even his answer was correct. No doubt the economy played a part in the way people voted last November, but I've seen a number of interviews with reasonably minded, rational thinking liberals who argued that they completely went out of their past character and voted for Donald Trump, not merely because of the economy, but because of what one liberal voter called the insanity of the Democratic Party. This is what he said. His number one reason for shifting to the Republican side of the ballot was because of what he called the gender-bending, pronoun-proliferating, fossil fuel banning, anti-white, anti-male, faith-bashing, open border insanity. Now remember, that comes from a liberal. In other words, the tone deafness of the last administration, they created their own crisis by pushing the policies of our nation so far to the left that they lost even left-leaning voters by and large. Well, so how have they responded to that crisis of decision? Well, some of the more extreme responses have been in what has been called the 4B movement. The 4B movement, the letter B, is based on a Korean movement that is essentially an anti-family position. The 4Bs come from 4 Korean words that each start with the letter B. The 4 words translate into a position of no marriage, no childbirth, no romantic relationships, and no sex with men. As white liberal women have lost their minds with this unexpected result of the November election, they have adopted this Korean 4B movement as a feminist challenge to the supposedly white straight males who elected Donald Trump and are plunging this nation over the cliff into disaster. Rolling Stone columnist Nikki McCann Ramirez explained that some women are swearing off men. That's her phrase. swearing off men for the next 4 years because a second Trump administration could be devastating for their reproductive rights. In other words, if abortion is restricted in any way, they've pledged to punish men by not having sex. I want to suggest that any policy that reduces the number of liberal white women having sex and getting pregnant, that in and of itself solves the abortion problem. So they're trying to punish the rest of us, but I say, man, knock yourself out. No romantic relationships, no out-of-wedlock sex, no serious engagement with the other gender. I think, frankly, American men are dodging a bullet. Now, how do we process this? This business of the 4B movement is just one of the examples of the extremism in response to what they perceive as the disaster of this election. By and large, the main branch of the Democratic Party, I expect, will respond moving forward the same way they responded in the mid-90s when they lost to a sweeping national movement toward the Republican Party back when Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House. What they did then was they hid the crazies in the basement, and they began to trot out more moderate Democrats and try to put a different public relations face on the party. I expect that's exactly what's going to happen moving forward. The media will interview a number of newer Democrat faces that argue that there is now a bigger tent available in the Democratic Party, one that has room for traditional values. They might even go so far as to claim that biblical Christianity is once again welcome in the Democratic Party, which is interesting because elected Democrats have publicly shamed Christians over the last several years. I suspect that Democratic officials will trot out fewer Sam Brittons. You know him, the guy with the mustache and the T-length skirts that serves in the Biden administration. We'll put some of the transgender craziness on the back burner, and instead we'll bring out more Democratic centrists who will try and court voters, especially blue-collar workers who largely abandoned the Democrats in November. They'll try and hide the insanity agenda and appeal again towards the middle. Well, it's not just that response of liberal women. It's not just what I suspect will be the strategy of the Democratic Party, but one thing that I think is interesting moving forward is this sort of family dilemma that we see now of progressives complaining that they are having to cut off their more conservative family members. Many on the left are responding to the electoral loss by cutting their ties with family members and with friends who they suspect voted for Trump. John Pavlovich, a left-wing liberal Christian pastor, once wrote a book entitled, "If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk." Well, that's a provocative title. And yet, following the election, on his Twitter account, his X account, he tweeted this: "I will never forgive my family members and former friends for voting for him. Never." That's interesting. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, unless that trespass was voting for Donald Trump. Love your enemies unless those enemies disagree with you politically. There is a spiritual as well as a political sickness displayed in all of this. If we cannot break bread together as friends and family despite political disagreements, then we will certainly find it difficult to live peacefully side by side as citizens of the same nation. This division is encouraged and enabled by overstimulated leftists who insist that President-elect Trump is not just a bad man or a bad president with bad policies, but they've bought the story that he is in fact Hitler incarnate. And because he is Hitler reincarnated, his supporters who voted for him must be equally evil. I heard one writer refer to him, the president-elect, as Orange Hitler. But see, here's the thing. If you have to beat Orange Hitler, there's no time for you to worry about inflation or the border crisis or why we were lied to about the advancing senility of President Biden. Certainly, there's no time to love your conservative neighbor. This, of course, is hysterical craziness. Why wasn't conservative media over the last 4 years filled with conservatives disavowing their liberal friends and threatening to cut them off after the Biden victory 4 years ago? Well, part of the reason is because conservatives still believe in the system of government that we have. You lose an election, you become the loyal opposition, you press your positions, and you try and win back the culture. They succeeded this time. But the left, with vapid arguments and no intellectual foundation to their ideas, they're left with only one thing. The enemy has to be cut off. They have to be discredited. They have to be hated. Rather than writing off our liberal and progressive family and friends, the lesson we need to learn here is that we are to remember, unlike their responses, we must desire their good, especially their eternal good. The Bible has one story that is particularly applicable here, and it is the small minor prophet in the Old Testament, the book of Jonah. I'm just going to give you some verses that you can look at later. But in Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we find that there was a message of truth that God handed to Jonah, and he said, go to a pagan city, people who have rejected me, and give them that message of truth because I seek to be reconciled to them. Well, that's the charge that we've been given. That's essentially the Great Commission. Take the message of truth and go to the world that needs to know a God who loves them and see if we can't introduce them to a God who wants to be reconciled. Well, in chapter 2, we find that Jonah didn't like that task, and he ran away, only to find himself swallowed up by a great fish. Chapter 2 is a prayer by Jonah to the Lord from inside the fish. When he is appropriately corrected by his 3 days in fish isolation, the fish vomits him up on the shore, and in chapter 3, God comes back to Jonah and says, the message is the same, the mission is the same. Go to the pagan city of Nineveh and tell them of coming judgment and urge them to repentance. That's the entire 3rd chapter. When we get to the 4th chapter, what we find in the first 2 verses is that Jonah delivers this message of coming judgment and an invitation to be reconciled to God, and a pagan city finds their way. They repent, they change their ways. The king issues a proclamation acknowledging that the God of Jonah is the true God. It's an incredible story. Only Jonah doesn't like the outcome. He gets mad and he says something incredible to God. I knew you are the kind of God who would hold off judgment and give mercy. And he spits those words out of his mouth almost like that's a bad thing. You see, Jonah saw the Ninevites as his political and spiritual enemies, and he wanted them judged. But God said, that's not my plan. You see, the left has decided that they can't live with us, that they want to cut us off, that they want to eliminate us because that's the only way they can ever be happy. Well, they're going to have to figure out the lessons to take from their electoral defeat. But what's the lesson for the rest of us? The lesson is this: we do not have the privilege of rejecting political opponents when we serve a God who loves those people and wants to draw them into relationship with Him. The left says, cut off your family and friends who voted for Trump. Well, we have to say, God does not give us permission to cut off our family and friends who voted for Harris. That's not the way this works. I think the Democrats will move to the center in the coming next couple of years. I think they'll try and move the crazies to the basement and hide them, at least for a while. We need to be diligent. We need to still fight the fight for the policies and the ideals that we think will make our country better and stronger. But we fight the fight understanding that ultimately we serve a God who wants all men to be reconciled to Him. And we have been made ambassadors of reconciliation, pleading with men to be reconciled to God. Don't let politics ruin family and friendship. It's not who we are. It may be who they are, but we are different. It's time for us to show that we're different. This is Truth Currents.